It's really unfortunate, but sometimes we make really bad choices in life, and for me, this was mine. Now, after a really good cleaning, it at least looks to be in great condition, but that's only because we installed about $60 worth of parts on it. So today, we're going to hopefully try and finish it up because we've already spent way too much time on it, and if we spend any more time on it, selling it will be out of the question. In today's video, we're going to be looking at this Weedeater brand lawnmower, and the problem is that the primer bulb is not working, so of course, starting the mower when the engine is cold is impossible. That means we need to take the carb off the engine so that we can not only check out why the primer bulb isn't working, but also service the carb if it needs it. Now, I'm going to try and repair this lawnmower, but yours might be different, so this might not work on yours. So if things are not working out for you, like in the video, please ask about it, and I'll be glad to answer your questions. So for those of you who didn't see the last video, we had to replace every single part related to the safety system, which is just insane that it was missing to begin with. And the only reason I went through with the project was because I happened to have a parts mower on hand that we robbed parts from. Otherwise, I would not have bothered with it and instead kept this mower for parts. Now, I really haven't talked too much about the parts mower before, but let's just say that of the two mowers, this was the better one to receive parts versus giving parts away. And if we do happen to get the engine running, now would be a great time to drain this terrible looking oil which has probably never been changed in its life. So first up is trying to figure out why this primer bulb is not working. And to help figure that out, it's best to take the air filter off to get a better look at it. Now, I have not done extensive testing on the topic, but I believe the fuel level plays a major role on if the primer bulb even works. So my thinking is that the fuel for the primer comes from the well directly below the carb and not directly from the tank itself. Now don't worry if you don't know what I'm talking about, I'll show you what I'm talking about here in a minute, but please let me know if I'm wrong. So yes, I did read the comments from the last video, and we'll talk more about the primer bulb itself when we get there. So back to the topic of the fuel level. If the mower has not been used for a long time, the well could be empty, making the primer bulb not work. And to get around this issue, most just fill the tank all the way to the top. Now the gasoline that was in the fuel tank is really old, but not old enough to keep it from running. But I would like to get out as much as I can before adding my own fresh ethanol-free gasoline. And if you can't get 100% gasoline without ethanol in your area, then try using some sort of stabilizer to help out. Now you don't need to get the fuel out of the tank to work on the carb, but it does keep you from making a mess. After that, just take out the two bolts that hold the fuel tank to the engine and then carefully pull the carb away from it and then disconnect the linkage. So when I was moving the carb away from the engine, I noticed something weird. There wasn't a lot of resistance. And the reason why was because the O-ring that seals the carb to the intake pipe was missing. So sometimes they might get stuck to the intake pipe, but as you can see, it's not there either, which means someone took this carb off and either lost it or never put it back on, not realizing how important it was. The next thing we need to do is to remove all the screws that hold the carb to the fuel tank and then separate them to inspect the diaphragm. Now, you'll want to be very careful doing this because you might damage an otherwise good part, which you might be able to reuse later on. Now on this one, it looks like the diaphragm is stuck to the flange on the tank, so you'll have to carefully persuade it off. And once we get the carb off the tank, we can now see the well that I was talking about. So basically, the pumping diaphragm helps to pull fuel from the tank and brings it to the well where the carb is able to then use it. That's the reason for the long pickup tube on the carb. It's pulling fuel from the bottom of the tank. Also, both the long and short tubes have screens on them to keep from picking up debris from the tank. I'll then take the screen off the shorter tube, and that's when we see an opening at the bottom that we need to make sure is clear. I'll then carefully remove the diaphragm that's stuck to the gasket on the bottom of the carb. Also, be very careful and do not lose the spring that's connected to the carb, otherwise the pump is not going to work the way it's supposed to. Now to be completely honest, this diaphragm is in decent condition and I wouldn't be afraid to reuse it. So if you didn't realize it, this is not the correct primer bulb for this carb. On this style of carb, the primer bulb cannot have a hole in the middle of it. Also, if you couldn't tell, this is a brand new primer bulb, meaning the last person who owned this mower ordered the wrong part not realizing it and installed it anyway. Now I can't blame them because ordering the wrong part for your mower is pretty easy to do. The design of the priming system for this carb has fuel coming up into the bulb and then it forces it into the engine. The other style with the hole in the bulb works on an entirely different type of carb that has fuel in a bowl. Now while I have the carb and tank apart, this would be a great time to clean them. I'll just put this carb in the ultrasonic cleaner while I spray a degreaser in the fuel tank and then rinse it out with my sprayer. Now you don't need to do it the way I'm showing you. You can use carb cleaner on the carb and just soap and water on the fuel tank if that's all you have on hand. Just make sure that you let both dry out before you put them back together and back onto the engine. Otherwise, any water in the fuel tank or carb could get in the way of the engine starting or running. So the carb is finally clean, and it's been sitting in the sun for quite a while, and it's quite dry and ready to be installed. Just remember to make sure that you run a wire through the opening at the bottom of the shorter pickup tube. After that, don't forget to reinstall the mesh screen over it because, believe me, it's quite easy to forget it. Now, I do have a new primer bulb that I bought in bulk some time ago, and because of that, it makes each one really cheap at roughly about $1 a piece. Just don't be surprised if you only end up buying one of them and find out that it's well over $7 for the one. If you didn't realize it, this is the original gasket I'm putting back into the tank, and the reason why is because I don't see anything wrong with it. Now, you might not agree with my choice, and I can respect that, and when you make your choice on the project you're working on, I'll support it too. Once we get all the screws tight for the carb, we'll then worry about replacing the missing O-ring for that intake. Now, don't get too worked up, but I don't have a spare retainer for this carb, so instead I'll just make sure the O-ring was large enough to stay in place. And just so long as the carb is held securely to the engine, it should stay sealed too. Now, if I come across another parts mower, I'll be sure to take the O-ring and retainer from it, but this should work for right now. And for those of you who know more about small engines than I do, will realize that I have the throttle lever in an odd orientation. Now, it should be okay since I made it work the way that it is, but if I get the chance, I will put it back the way it's supposed to be. Now, if your fuel tank has a crack in it or there's a problem with the carb, they still make aftermarket versions of these. Now, they're not as cheap as other carbs, but that's because they have a fuel tank that's connected to them, so it makes sense. Next, we'll finally install the new and correct primer bulb, and yes, I am taking a huge risk by using a screwdriver to do this. Now, you can use a deep socket to do the same thing, but I like the control from the screwdriver better, and you'll see what I mean when you try using the socket. So here's where my penny pinching shows up. I'm going to only put in about a quarter tank of fuel for my testing. Now, the problem is that this is not enough fuel to fill the well below the carb, which means the primer bulb isn't going to work, at least not right now. And if you want to avoid this situation, I would just fill the tank all the way to the top. But for me, to get it to work, I'm going to prime the engine with some fuel first and then get it to run for a couple of seconds. This will then make the pump work to bring fuel up from the tank and into the well, and then we'll see if the primer works after that. So luckily the engine did run for a bit, but because the well was dry, it wasn't able to feed fuel to the engine. But we at least should be able to use the primer now, which as you can see is working like it should be. So is there a good reason why I just don't fill up the tank and avoid this whole situation? Well, the answer is yes there is, but I'll talk more about it here in a bit after the test start. So it's been running for about 5 minutes, so it should be close to normal operating temperature. Let's see if it'll start back up when it's hot. Now luckily for us, it started back up, which is fantastic news, but what happens if it didn't start back up? So if that happens to you, I would check and see if it was a fuel or carb problem, and if it isn't, then I check the valve clearances. I'm also going to take this opportunity to drain out all that dirty oil and then replace it with some brand new oil. Just be careful how much oil you put back into the engine. Too much oil in the engine is not good for it, so try and get as close to the full mark as possible without going over it. Now it can be just a tad bit over the full mark, but I'd rather it be just a bit below the full mark than over it. And if the oil level is over the full mark by quite a bit, just tip the mower over on its side and take out a couple of ounces and then check it one more time. I've also received a couple of good questions about what kind of oil to use in these, and it really depends on what brand of engine you have. So I would definitely search online and find your brand of engine to ensure what kind of oil to use. I almost forgot to put that sticker back on the cover for the engine, otherwise the cover looks kind of bland without it. So here's the reason why I don't fill the tank up all the way with gasoline, and that's because if I did, I wouldn't be able to tell if the pump was working. But with the fuel tank less than full, you'll be able to figure out if the pump is working if the engine is able to stay running. Basically, the mower will continue to run as long as the tank is mostly full, but if the pump is not working, the engine will stop once the level has dropped below the well. Either way, it's your choice if you want to test it with a full tank or not. I, on the other hand, just like doing it this way. I do want to start it back up one more time just to make sure the primer is working. So it appears the primer is working now, and all it took was installing the correct primer bulb for this type of carb. Now I can't fault the previous owner for trying to fix their mower, but I can fault them for selling a mower without the safety system intact. It is your choice if you want to buy it, and the only reason I did was because I was prepared to fix it. But you only have so many fingers and toes, and losing one or more to a mower is not what I want to do. So my question is, have you ever installed a part on the machine and only later realized that it was the wrong one? Now, I don't recall if that ever happened, but sometimes when ordering aftermarket parts that are supposed to be compatible with other parts has resulted in less than stellar results. Thank you for watching. I really do appreciate your time here. Please feel free to ask me any questions about this project or about your own projects, and I hope to see you in the next video.